Good evening, everyone. My name is Casey Arnold, and I serve as Vice President of Engagement for the University of Illinois Alumni Association. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We very much appreciate your support of our Alumni College Speaker Series and are excited to welcome back several repeat attendees. But before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'd like to take a moment to talk about what's happening at your Alumni Association. On the membership front, we are excited to offer a new opportunity, the Life Membership Program at the University of Illinois Alumni Association. For a one-time fee of $1,500, which can conveniently be spread over 5 years, you can enjoy lifelong benefits and become an integral part of our thriving community. Each new Life member will receive a custom Alumni Association blanket as a token of our appreciation. To learn more about this wonderful opportunity and to join our proud network of Life members, please visit uiaa.org/life-membership. We're also excited to announce that planning for our 2025 homecoming celebration is underway and we need your help. Homecoming is scheduled for September 21st to 27th, and we're asking you to help us set this year's theme. Right now, we're inviting alumni to submit potential theme ideas, and later this spring, we'll hold a vote to select the winner. If you're interested in submitting a theme idea, please use the submission link I will share in the chat. Finally, before I introduce our speaker this evening, I'd like to remind everyone to please submit questions during the presentation via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will have time left at the end for your questions, and we will get through as many as possible in the time allotted. Also, if you are interested in reviewing this presentation at a later date, a recording will be posted to the Speaker Series section of our website within the next 10 business days. Now let's get to why we've all logged on tonight, which is to hear from another esteemed member of our Illinois faculty. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Ilana Redstone. Ilana Redstone is the author of The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less, published in September of 2024. She has a joint PhD in demography and sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. More about her work is at www.ilanaredstone.com. And with that, it is my great pleasure to turn the program over to Professor Redstone.
Thank you so much, Casey. And I just want to thank everyone for being here and for just being interested in this work. That's sort of the greatest thing I could ask for. So I want to share my screen here. Okay, so you should see just this slide, the certainty trap. And where I want to start is with a quote. Actually, a short story is really more of what it is. It's from, some of you may be familiar with a graduation speech that's actually 20 years old this year. It was given by award-winning writer David Foster Wallace at Kenyon College in 2005. And so I'm not going to read the whole speech, but it is an amazing speech. You can easily find it online. So if you've heard this part before, just bear with me. So this is from an excerpt from that, one of the parables that he tells. He says, there are these two guys sitting together in a bar in the remote Alaskan wilderness. One of the guys is religious, the other is an atheist, and the two are arguing about the existence of God with that special intensity that comes after about the fourth beer. And the atheist says, look, it's not like I don't have actual reasons for not believing in God. It's not like I haven't ever experimented with the whole God and prayer thing. Just last month, I got caught away from the camp, and in that terrible blizzard, I was totally lost and couldn't see a thing, and it was 50 below, and so I tried it. I fell to my knees in the snow and cried out, oh God, if there is a God, I'm lost in this blizzard, and I'm going to die if you don't help me. And now, in the bar, the religious guy looks at the atheist all puzzled, and he says, well, then you must believe now, he says. After all, here you are alive. The atheist just rolls his eyes. No, man, all that was a couple of Eskimos happened to come wandering by and showed me the way back to camp. David Foster Wallace has a lot to say on this, but it includes a version of the following, and now I'm going to switch to my words, not his. Many people hear this story as a warning or a reminder to not call, in this case, one man right and the other one wrong. But to focus on this and this alone risks missing a broader point about their mutual dismissal, their dismissal of one another. The non-religious guy is certain in his dismissal of the possibility that the passing Eskimos had anything to do with his prayer for help. And to be sure, while we may not see it in this particular story, there are plenty of religious people who seem arrogant and certain of their own interpretations as well. Wallace points out the religious dogmatist problem is the same as the story's unbeliever. Blind certainty amounts to a closed-mindedness that leads to an imprisonment so total that the prisoner doesn't even know he's locked up. So Wallace doesn't connect this to political topics in his speech. That's where, but that is that wording, that way of understanding the world is definitely an inspiration for the work on the certainty trap and sort of thinking about its implications for both democracy and sort of how we coexist with disagreement. I want to be clear that in this talk, I mean something specific when I use the word certainty. I mean a person can either be certain about something or not. So you can't, in the way that I'm using this term, a person can't be a little bit or a lot certain. That, which, as we'll talk about as we go along, that's something that I call confidence. So how, as in how confident can you be in a particular claim? So certainty, now that we've defined it more on the same page, does all kinds of things to our thinking, most of which are not good. Some of those things are obvious. So for example, this is Jonas Salk. He may look familiar to some of you. He invented the polio vaccine, and he did this by asking a question. If benign viruses are injected into a healthy person's bloodstream, would the person's immune system create antibodies that would prove resistant to future exposure? A version of this had been tried previously, but Salk pushed forward anyway in the 50s. And he succeeded. But he started with a question that had he treated this issue as closed, as certain, as given, definitive, and done, he never would have asked. Certainty makes this kind of inquiry impossible. So that's one of the more self-evident effects of certainty. Some of what it does, and I'm going to talk about two other consequences, some of what it does is a little bit less obvious. Here's one consequence. So if it does, first it keeps us from asking questions. It also makes us forget that we might be wrong. So sometimes people think of this in terms of intellectual humility. Um, this this image on the screen, some of you might remember the movie Men in Black. And so there's Will Smith on the left, his character, and the blurry face is the character of Tommy Lee Jones. And this is the point in the movie when Will Smith's character has kind of just learned that there are in the movie, that there are aliens walking all among them and all over and all with them on the planet. And so Tommy Lee Jones' character says to him, 1,000 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, they knew the Earth was flat. 15 minutes ago, you knew we humans were alone on it. Imagine what you'll know tomorrow. So we have these first two consequences. One is that certainty keeps us from asking questions. The other is that it makes us forget that we might be wrong. The third is perhaps the least obvious. Certainty also keeps us from being clear about our assumptions and our values. So here I just have a picture of a guy stealing a car. Seems hopefully pretty clear. But let's imagine that you and I are looking out a window and we see someone stealing a car. And let's assume that we have every reason to believe that the car is not theirs, they don't have permission to use it, etc. And I turn and I look at you as we're looking out the window and we see this going on, and I say, wow, that's crazy. Can you believe that guy? I'm making a very particular assumption that most often I would not bother saying explicitly or saying out loud. That is that you share my value that stealing is wrong. It's probably not a bad assumption. It is, however, an assumption. And it's certainly me not having to say that out loud makes our interaction a lot more efficient, smoother, more familiar, right? I don't have to stop and ask you first, hey, do you think stealing is wrong? Before I turn to you and I say, wow, can you believe that guy? So these second and third consequences in particular lead us to conclude that whoever disagrees, somebody who sees things differently. So by the second and third, I mean, the second was that it keeps us from sort of bearing in mind that we might be wrong, and that it keeps us from being clear about our assumptions and values. So these lead us to conclude that anyone who disagrees must be either hateful or stupid. And I want to be really clear. I want to give you a bunch of examples so that we're clear about what that means. And what that looks like is judgment. So I'm going to start with a couple of examples that are You may find them controversial or contentious. They're not generally considered politically contentious. And then we'll transition to some that are. So as I read through these, I want you to bear in mind that we're not so there's the column on the left, which is about certainty, and there's the column on the right, which is what I am saying is a judgment that could come out of treating the first statement as certain. There is a time and a place to sort of argue about the claims that I'm treating as certain. This is not that time. What I'm saying is just go through the thought experiment of treating it as given. Just read through the statement on the left and just treat it as given. And we're just going to ask the question, okay, if we treat that as given, what's the kind of thing that can come out the other side? So the first one is a healthy relationship means never going to bed angry. If we again, all we're doing is treating that as given. I'm not arguing about it. That's not what our goal is here. We're just treating it as given. The judgment: couples who don't resolve conflicts immediately must not really care about each other. That would be one example. Another example: successful people wake up early and follow a strict morning routine. Treat it as given, treat it as certain, definitive, final. Anyone who sleeps past 7 a.m. lacks the discipline needed for a real success. And the third: good parents always put their children first, no matter what. If we treat that as given, one of the judgments that would follow: parents who prioritize their own needs sometimes are being selfish. So again, we're saying in the first column, treat it as given and see the judgment that can come out from the fact of treating that as given. So now I promised you some more controversial examples. And so here are two that are related. The first one: gender is a social construct. Treat it as given. Again, I want to be really clear about what I'm saying. I'm saying just treat what's in the first column as though it is certain in the way that we've defined certainty at the start of our conversation. Treat it as given. Gender is a social construct. Anyone who believes in innate gender differences must be perpetuating patriarchal oppression. That would be one. And again, there are different ways to word these. There's different ways. It's not the only judgment that could come out, but that's one possible. Biology and gender are unrelated. Anyone who questions whether children should be given puberty blockers is transphobic. Again, when you treat you might think of it as an input. When you treat the first statement as given, the judgment follows. So the last examples that I'm going to give you in this table, of these three sets of tables, the last examples are probably, for some of you, maybe even the most contentious. And I'm going to put them up, and then I'm going to sort of dive into them a little bit more. Here it is. Even here. So this certainty judgment pattern. The 2020 election was completely secure. Anyone questioning election procedures must be promoting dangerous conspiracy theories. The second one: the 2020 presidential election was a sham. Anyone who accepts the election results must be brainwashed by mainstream media. So again, I'm saying treat what's in the first column as certain, as given and definitive, and see the judgment that comes out the other side. Now, at this point, one of the things that people will often get concerned about, and I want to be clear about, is that avoiding the certainty trap, avoiding the problem of certainty, doesn't suddenly mean that any explanation is as good, as likely as any other. That's the space of confidence this is the difference between certainty and confidence that we were talking about at the beginning. I want to make sure that this is really clear. So if I'm saying nothing is certain, I'm saying that what we know and understand about the world could exist on a number line. So on the left, we have definitely wrong, not true. And on the right, we have definitely right and true. So I'm going to give a bunch of examples. And there's nothing, I'm going to attach numbers to them and place them along this line. Please understand that there is nothing scientific about the numbers that I'm attaching. I literally made them up. And part of the point is that actually we could argue about what should move something further to the right or further to the left. But let me start with one. And I actually, for these numbers, I only went out 2 decimal places, and there's no reason you couldn't go out further. But in the interest of space, that was as far as I went. Here's the first one. The Earth is flat. I put this down here. I put it down at 0.01. You might put it even further closer to 0. You might write so that you could you could imagine that people would have different numbers that they would tie to that, but that's where I put it. Coffee is good for your health. I think it's probably not. I'm fairly confident that it's not good for your health. So I'm putting it at that at a 0.3. I think that's unlikely. And again, remember, there's nothing scientific about where I'm putting these numbers. So my third one, there is intelligent life somewhere else in the universe. I really don't know. I'm going to put this one at 0.5. Sometimes, depending on the day, sometimes I think it's probably higher than that. But I'm going to put it at 0.5. Exercise makes people healthier. I'm fairly confident that that's true, so I'm going to give that a 0.7. The sun will rise tomorrow. I certainly hope it does, and certainly all of my past experience tells me that it will. I'm going to give that a 0.95. Again, I can imagine an argument that would say to put that higher. And then I'm going to look at I'm just going to put out 0.99 here. And I told you I was only going out 2 decimal places. And there's a whole bunch of things that we treat as certain, and it doesn't really matter. The idea of the certainty trap isn't that we need to be questioning everything all of the time, because for a lot of what we treat as certain, there are really no consequences and there's certainly no political consequences. So what kinds of examples might those be? If I drop a ball on Earth, it will fall forward. And again, 0.99, I'm only going out 2 decimal places. Breathing air helps keeps humans alive. There's stuff all around us. This is a chair. All of these, and you could imagine and sort of a near infinite number of these kinds of statements about the way the world is, and that we treat them all as given. And there's nothing about avoiding the certainty trap that says that we need to start questioning them, because the trap part is, as we'll talk about, the trap part is the contempt that comes from the judgment. So if there's no judgment and no contempt, there's no trap. And you can question it if you find that interesting. I do. But there's no trap that we're trying to solve for. Okay, so I want to apply this to contentious topics. One of them, and I'm going to give you 2 examples here. One of them is the one that we saw earlier in the table, one of the tables, and the other one we didn't. Each of these is not, in fact, certain, even though we treat them as though they are, and that has all kinds of implications. One of those implications is that we can't even get to a discussion about where they would actually belong and what would move them to the left or to the right, and because we can't, that requires recognizing the uncertainty in the first place. Any conversation about where along this axis it should be requires recognizing the uncertainty in the first place. So here's one. This is the one that we said before. Gender is a social construct. The conversation that we never get to is sort of where on this axis should it be. Here's another example. Disparities are evidence of racism. Again, as with the gender as a social construct, we don't get into this conversation, because in order to have that conversation, you have to first acknowledge the uncertainty. Okay. Now, another one of the concerns that comes up when I talk about this work on the problem of certainty is a concern that avoiding the problem of certainty means that we can't determine anything about where this statement belongs. And I just picked this as an example. So on the screen, we have being nice to people is important. And so one of the concerns is that avoiding the problem of certainty means that it's just any place that you put this on the axis is as good as any other. And right, this is sort of almost a moral relativism fear, that there's just, why would any place be better than or worse than any other place on this axis? And that is the reason that that's not the case at all. That in other words, there's nothing about avoiding the problem of certainty that means that any place on the axis for being nice to people is important, is as good as any other. And the reason for that is that where that belongs is fully functional. It's functionally dependent on what the goal is. And what certainty keeps us from doing is being clear about that goal. So for example, let's say I have a goal, and I made this up. I could imagine, I'll give you another example in a second, but here my goal is developing and mentoring junior employees in a workplace. I can imagine an argument that would say being nice to people in this case is important. I could imagine a different goal that would be something like, living in a politically pluralistic society. I would imagine personally that that would also shift this being nice to people is important closer to the one. That would shift it to the right on this axis. I can also imagine scenarios where it's totally on the other side. Like where this whole being nice to people is important is it nope, not it was move it all the way as close to zero as it can possibly get, or very close to zero, right? So something like this. Leading an emergency response in a crisis. Let's say that's our goal. I, it would make sense to me that being nice to people is probably lower priority if that's our goal than if we're trying to mentor junior employees in a workplace or trying to live together in a politically pluralistic society. You can actually see how this works with a contemporary example and I'm going to use the example of immigration as well. So let's say that this is again a statement about what we think the world should be like. We should welcome as many people as possible who are fleeing worse situations in other countries. So let's say this is my idea about immigration. Where that belongs is a function of what the goal is. So for example, if the goal of immigration is to provide sanctuary to as many people as possible, then it makes sense to move that to the right. If the goal, is that immigration should benefit the economy for people already in the host country, that's a totally different goal. And it's not entirely clear to me how we should welcome as many people as possible who are fleeing worse situations in other countries, how it serves that goal. And so part of what I'm saying here is that what certainty does is it keeps us from making the goal clear. It keeps us from making our assumptions clear, and it keeps us from making the goal clear. And when we aren't clear about those, as one of the example we saw early on was about the car thief, right, in the car thief case, but that wasn't a political example. With contentious topics, when we're not clear about them, we don't get to actually have a conversation about them, think through them out in the open, think through them on our own, frankly, even just in the isolation of our own minds. I want to give you, because this is a group of UI alumni, I want to give you a University of Illinois specific example of what this can look like. And this is an example from last spring. So I was and this is, I don't think there was anyone involved in this at any point where there was any ill intent. Nor do I think that the example that I'm giving you, in fact, I know it's not unique to the University of Illinois. I'll use this because it was something that I was able to witness firsthand. On one of the committees that was reviewing new courses for the university, a course came across the threshold at the end of, this is a committee that I was on last year. A course came across the threshold that was called Racism in the United States. And the committee was supposed to approve the course. And in the course, part of the approval process included, if every course that gets submitted includes a syllabus and some information about what's being taught. And this course called Racism in the United States, it was proposed by the psychology department, what looked like an interesting class. I mean, it looked to me like an interesting class. It talked about, there were sections in the syllabus that described systemic racism, unconscious bias, etc. Fairly standard fare for a course on at least how we think about racism in the United States. And what I said during the committee meeting is I said, this looks interesting. It makes sense. I don't think it should be called I don't think it should be called Racism in the United States. What it is a progressive view of racism in the United States. It should still be, like, in my view, it should still be taught. It makes sense. Like, it seems like an interesting class. It is not, but it is not right to call it a racism in the United States. What it is, call it what it is, which is a progressive view of racism in the United States. That is not unique to the University of Illinois. I don't think there was anybody who had ill intent in that process. And that is the consequence of certainty. The blurring of that line, the not making clear our goals, the not making clear our assumptions, and the way that line gets blurred. And it's very easy to do. So if just to continue with that example, if you look at a course like the one that was described, you might end up with a couple of things that are treated as given. One of them was the one that I gave before, disparities are evidence of discrimination. And two, and I'm sort of making these up as concrete examples. Unconscious bias shows us that racism is everywhere. So you could ask yourself, what are some of the judgments that might come out of that? In my raising this question, I'm not saying that that's not a claim that we should ignore disparities or that unconscious bias doesn't matter. What I'm saying, again, I'm making this narrow point about when you treat things as certain, when you say this is given, particularly on a politically contested topic, you end up with judgment, you end up with contempt, and you end up with ultimately political polarization and declining social trust, declining trust in institutions. That is sort of the chain of events. And what I'm describing in part is the mechanism that makes that sort of sets that makes that work. So I want to pause for just a second. And I want to point out that I'm saying avoiding the certainty trap matters. So I should hold myself to the same standard that I'm saying that as in the examples that I'm using. So we might challenge that. The extent to which avoiding the certainty trap matters also depends on the goal. And I would say the way I would think about that is, if your goal is to live with disagreement in a politically pluralistic society, or if your goal is to understand as best we can what's true about the world, avoiding the certainty trap is somewhere to the right. If you care about neither of those things, or you care about some other set, if you have some other set of goals, like, so, my most important goal is to be right. My most important goal is to win an election. You can imagine or my most important goal is to build a really big following on social media. These are different, fundamentally different sets of incentives. If your goal is to live in a politically pluralistic society, live with disagreement, or to understand what's true about the world, then avoiding the certainty trap is, in fact, important. Okay, and I want to make clear why that's the case. It matters. Why does it matter for political pluralism? So part of this we said before, but I want to make really clear what this chain is. Certainty leads to judgment. Judgment leads to contempt. Contempt leads to resentment, and resentment erodes trust. It erodes trust. It erodes trust both at a social level, and, as I was saying before, it erodes trust in institutions, including in higher education. Now, what about understanding what's true about the world? Well, avoiding the certainty trap matters for understanding what's true as well. And so I've just tried to draw this out as in a way that is visually sort of easy to understand. So if on the vertical axis, on the y-axis, I wrote the amount we don't know, and I said at the top is lots. This is a stylized graph, obviously. Lots, and down toward the bottom is not much. So how much do we still not know? And then on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, is time, where we have earlier moving to later as you go from left to right. How much we still don't understand about the world, again, on the y-axis, and time on the x-axis. Part of avoiding the certainty trap means understanding that, and I have this line here, this curve never crosses the x-axis, that there's always some chance that you're wrong. There's always something else that you could learn. There's always something else that you could know. And there's always some chance that everything that we know today, that we think we know today, we learn something tomorrow that upends all of it. And so that's the humility when it comes to understanding the world and, frankly, one another. Okay, so now what? What do you do about this? I can see my cat in the background. So one of the sort of nice things about, in terms of what now and what do you do about it, is you don't need anything other than your own mind in order to sort of take the first step right now. And what I mean by that is understanding that controversial topics are morally and ethically complicated. So if something seems simple to you, there's a good chance that it's not. Anything can be questioned. Questioning requires naming. So if we want to question my assumption, just to go back to one of the earlier examples, that Immigration is the goal of immigration is to provide sanctuary to its people for fleeing worse situations. If I don't name that, it's very hard for someone else to question it, right? So part of it is just being very clear and explicit in our thinking. Questioning something doesn't always mean disagreeing with it. So if I say, and actually that's the inverse of that is the fourth one. Trying on an idea doesn't always mean agreeing with it. So by the third one, questioning something doesn't always mean disagreeing with it. By that I mean, if I say, why is slavery bad? That is not an argument. That is not inherently an argument that slavery isn't bad. I am asking, and I've done this with students, I am asking us to, I'm saying there's value in going through the explicit and clear thinking of saying, why is this thing bad? Why is rape bad? Why is slavery bad? Why are these things bad? And that asking that question does not mean that I think that they're not bad. And then the last one that I said, trying on an idea doesn't always mean agreeing with it. So if I say, I wonder what the benefits are of living in a dictatorship, it doesn't mean I want to move to North Korea, or doesn't necessarily mean I want to move to North Korea. So giving yourself and the people around you the space to think things through openly, that's what this is fundamentally about. So I would say you can try it. And you don't have to do this. You can do it in conversation with somebody else. And you don't have to do it right now. Part of this is you could be in conversation with somebody else, but it could also just be while you're sitting alone in your room, and just thinking about so what's on the slide, try it. Pick an issue that you feel strongly about. It doesn't have to be a political topic, but I think for a lot of people, those are the topics, excuse me, those are the kinds of topics that elicit the strongest reaction. Pick an issue that you feel strongly about, so strongly that you don't see how anyone could disagree, or any reasonable person could disagree. Any non-hateful, non-stupid person could disagree. And challenge yourself to think of how a person with good intentions and the same information that you have might see things differently. So this last part about the same information that you have, it means that you don't get to say, well, they just don't know. That's not an argument that education doesn't matter. Obviously, we're in higher education. I'm simply saying in that last part that this idea that the thing that keeps us apart, that keeps us from agreeing with one another on immigration, abortion, gun control, Black Lives Matter, whatever else, is that we don't have the same information. And if the other person just knew what I knew, then we'd agree. That assumption it does not hold. And so that would be something that you can try just on your own. And the interactions, how do I talk to my ex person who doesn't agree, or who whatever the person is in your life that for some of you may think of. This is about modeling the thinking yourself, and the way that you enter. You can't control what someone else is going to do. You can control and control may be the wrong word, but you can shape your own thinking. And you can model your own behavior. And so when we change the thinking, the shift in the communication comes out of the transformation in the thinking. And it's not, the communication is one of the benefits. It's not actually the focus of this work, if that makes sense. Okay, so I want to make sure that I've thrown a lot at you. I want to make sure that I have additional slides that we can come to if they are relevant for the questions. If you find this work useful, the best thing you can do is spread the word, and just talk to people about it, and keep the conversation going. So I'm going to turn off my screen share and see where we're at.
Thanks so much, Dr. Redstone. Just a reminder, we've had a few folks start submitting questions via that question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. But if you haven't submitted yours yet and would like to, please go ahead and do that now. We've got plenty of time left for questions. One question that we got in the chat is whether or not Dr. Redstone has researched or come across any research about whether or not people who have lived in different countries are more or less likely to succumb to the certainty trap, possibly due to having had to regularly revisit what they had considered to be certain.
That is such an interesting question. I have not done that. So actually, I'm just starting now. One of the things that's challenging with kind of empirically measuring the certainty trap is that you're trying to measure something that people aren't aware that they're in. And so what you end up having to do is measure the consequences. So like which is basically the way we judge other people, the way we think about disagreement. That's actually that's an interesting hypothesis. It makes sense to me. And I know that I'm in the beginning of the book, I have a chance to talk about this, that in my own life, certainly traveling and living in different cultures, different countries played a huge role for in all the ways that the person asking the question is describing. So I think it makes sense to me. I haven't tested it, but it would make sense.
We got another question talking about sometimes how major events will sort of cause a society-wide lack of certainty. So for example, when the Titanic sank, it caused a lot of people to question whether or not progress that they had seen during that time period was a good or a bad thing, since that ship was supposed to be unsinkable. What are some more
Yeah.
modern examples of events that you feel like have really shaken certainty at a society-wide level, at least here in the United States?
Well, it's interesting. So when you think about society, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it in the other direction, events that trigger actual certainty. But this is so like, but it's events that sort of trigger uncertainty. I think I haven't really thought about that, but it's a great question. And my intuition is that anything, every generation has at least one, sometimes multiple moments where you're sort of faced with your mortality. You're faced with sort of oh, the world can be a horrible, scary. I'm 51. It was a lot of people from my generation think it was the Challenger explosion. Or it could be, for earlier, it could be the Kennedy assassination. It could be 9/11. It could be COVID. It could, right. And that really just sort of makes you question everything that you think you know about the world. So I would think all of those things. And I don't know, I think there's probably something about what age you are when these things happen and where you are in the life cycle and your own sort of developmental awareness. Um, yeah, that triggers sort of uncertainty. Yeah, there's a separate part about what triggers certainty, which we can talk
I'm
about.
curious about that actually. Could you give an example of
Oh,
some events that have
so
triggered
what triggers
certainty?
certainty? So actually, yeah. So what triggers certainty. And particular what triggers the certainty trap, which is how I think we got into the moment that we're in with respect to the certainty trap, is a lot of times some sort of like really sizable moral failure. So the two examples, like societal level moral failure. And by that I mean, um, one example is slavery, I think, right? So like the sort of coming to terms in the middle of the 20th century, like coming to terms with through the civil rights movement, with desegregation, coming to terms with sort of what are come to be considered great moral failures. Another one would be the Holocaust, right? Like that I think of, and those moral failures, part of what we tend to do at least as far as I can tell, and what I've paid attention to, um, part of what we tend to do is we say, God, the thing that we did was so horrible. It was so odious, so inhuman, so just despicable in every way. Never again will we allow this to happen. We will never allow this to happen again, which makes total sense. And it also creates a sort of what I've called, and in the second book, I'll write about this more, intent blindness. So it creates the idea that it doesn't matter. Like, so, and actually, I think the Holocaust in Germany, I think it can be an easy example. This idea is this sort of post World War II, there was a spate of laws introduced against hate speech, right? Totally trying to say we will never have this, we will never allow this to happen again. Part of what that's meant has been comments that are often considered controversial, conservative, whatever, about, particularly in that case, about immigration, are often any question about, should we have any concerns about immigrant integration? Most people in most settings would say, I can imagine a scenario where that would be a reasonable thing to wonder about. it all gets bucketed with intent blindness, the kind of intent blindness that comes from the sense of never again, we will never let this happen again. It all gets lumped into one bucket. Um, for a totally again, I think from a totally understandable reason, but intent blindness always creates a backlash. As far as I can tell, it without exception in very predictable ways, because you can see it happen across time and space. Like anytime any society says intent doesn't matter, you do create a certainty trap.
Kind of along the same line of thinking about things throughout time and sort of on a continuum, one of our guests wanted to know, do you feel that there is a trend um, in people being more or less certain about their beliefs today than opposed to other times in human history? Are we becoming sort of more or less certain as a society?
Uh, so I think, and I one of the things I tried to show with the examples that we looked at, um, certainty, this relationship, part of what I'm doing with this work is just, and I'll come back to that question in a second. Part of what I'm trying to do in this work is just kind of explain, like, this is what's going on. Like, this is the relationship between certainty and judgment. Like, particularly when I say judgment, I mean moral outrage, righteous indignation. It comes from something, right? It's what drives it is certainty. You can make all kinds of different arguments about it, about whether the benefits of certainty, whatever they may be. Um, but this is part of what I'm doing, is just describing that this is what happens. And then we get to make choices. If we understand how this works, we can make conscious choices about, well, okay, do we like the path that we're on? Do we like the consequence? Do we like the costs of this? So have we become more certain? I think there's a couple of ways to think about that. I would say so I'm going to talk specifically about the US in this case. Yes. And the reasons, so one of the reasons that there are a couple of reasons people often point to in terms of how did we get to this particular moment that we're in. One is social media, right? Like sort of the echo chambers of social media, and the anonymity sometimes, like the fact the asynchronicity of the interactions. Like there's all these different things about social media. The incentives that outrage tends to get more reposts and likes and whatever. People will also say, um, cable news programming, for example, like that this is in order to get better ratings, more viewers, like we went into this world of that we have to have more sensation, more people yelling at each other, more, right? So like that's the thing that's going to get eyeballs onto your show. So I think the way I see it, these are all catalysts. These have all played a role. I don't think that they explain the kind of the mechanism or the cause. And I think that, again, so in the US case, that comes back to intent blindness. And specifically, it comes back to thinking about, we had a very specific moment. Okay, so I want to be very careful about how I'm thinking about how I'm expressing this thought. We had a very specific moment in this country where we said, and this was I gave the example of Germany earlier, and I gave and the Holocaust, and I talked about the slavery in the U.S. example, um, where we said intent doesn't matter. And it was in a very narrow context and be more specific in a second. It was in a relatively narrow context that, frankly, based on what I've read, made a lot of sense at the time. And we also sort of never dealt with the underlying moral principle that went along with that decision. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about this idea that I'm talking about disparate impact theory is really what I'm talking about. So this idea that disparities, and I alluded to this in the earlier part of the talk, that disparities are evidence of discrimination. This is a Supreme Court decision in 1971. And it was frankly it was a unanimous decision. It was without going into a lot of detail, I think it made a lot of sense. Like, I think it was probably, you could totally see reading about this decision, like, yeah, that made sense. Like that company, it was Duke Power versus Griggs versus Duke Power. Sorry. And it seemed like the right decision, right? And at the same time, the underlying moral principle that says that intent doesn't matter when it comes to discrimination, that principle, there's no way to contain it. Now you're in the space of ideas. You take what was a narrow sort of legal theory and you say, okay, well, the underlying moral, if intent doesn't matter when it comes to discrimination, then why should it matter for anything else? Like anything else that we view as harmful. So in this country, we have this very specific moment with that I don't in any way want to minimize the importance of. And I think that it can be that you can trace out sort of this intent blindness and consequences from the sort of like the broad adoption of an underlying moral principle. It changed the moral framework. It fundamentally changed how we think about right and wrong and good and bad and what is racist and what is not. In For reasons that were totally understandable, at least to me. Um, that doesn't change the fact that they led to other changes. They led to other consequences. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think a lot of these topics they're really complicated and really complex, and I think they're often bound up, not only in sort of what's happening around us, but it's a lot of personal feelings and values, judgments, and things like that.
Yeah.
So, unsurprisingly, we've gotten a ton of questions from folks sort of asking for some advice on how do they deal, with difficult conversations that are going on in their lives. And so one person asked, could you talk about some ways to discuss with another person, who's absolutely certain about a particular topic when in reality there's actually a lot of disagreement about it. So someone who's just really set in their viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. Like, and this is what I mean. I do want to be clear that like, I don't. It's not a magic solution for sort of changing. Like, this is really about kind of like looking in the mirror and saying like, how am I thinking about things? So I'll give you an example. I could give you two examples. One where I was successful and one where I personally failed. And so the one where I was successful, so I was talking to a friend of mine. This was about probably a year and a half ago, and she is someone who she tends to be more. I'm not like I don't love the term conspiracy theories because it feels very dismissive to me. It's not a way of thinking that I'm generally drawn to. She is. And so we were having a conversation one time and she was saying that um she was talking about sex trafficking. And she was saying that, in her view, she was like, this was basically a conspiracy, or it was kind of an orchestrated decision at the highest levels of power to not crack down on I don't remember if it was child sex trafficking or sex trafficking in general, and that it was because people, politicians, et cetera, elected officials were benefiting from, this was her saying this, were benefiting from the practice, right? And so that they actually had this incentive to not crack down on this. And I was talking to her and I said, okay, I got that. I said, I see how you got there. I said, okay, let me give you another possible explanation. Here's how I see another possible explanation. Um, no one is necessarily benefiting from this. And for reasons that I don't fully understand, I don't know that we necessarily, any of us, have a great understanding of why some social problems rise to the top of the pile and why some don't. Right, like probably has to do with something about lobbying, with advocacy, with numbers, right? Like there's probably a number of different factors. And then there's some, a little bit of a black box of sort of how that all works. For whatever reason, sex trafficking hasn't risen to the top of the pile, at least in the way that she thinks it should. It hasn't risen to the top of the pile. That has no implications and no assumptions about anyone benefiting, anybody, any big conspiracy theory. Right? So like this is what I said to her. I said, so that's another possible explanation. I said, so why should I believe your explanation over mine? Like I see how you got there. Why would I pick that explanation over this one? Where you will end up when you do that almost always comes down to trust in institutions. And one of the things that erodes trust in institutions is certainty. It is the certainty. I mean, it's right up there with corruption and cronyism, right? It will destroy trust in institutions. So that's sort of a more successful version of, I didn't, right? It was just, I was just asking her the question, why should I believe that? But really like, why? So help me understand why I should believe that versus this. When I was unsuccessful, I can give you an example of just being, totally failing at this. And this is not a political example, but I think it illustrates the same point. I was talking to a friend This was last fall. I was talking to a friend who's married, and she has her kids are a little bit younger than my own. They're middle schoolers, and she was in an argument with her husband about parenting, something probably lots of people can sympathize with. So she was in an argument with her husband about parenting, and she said, so she was telling me about this, and so that was enough of a heated argument in an otherwise stable marriage that her husband had had a guys weekend trip planned coming up, and she had a work weekend trip planned the following weekend. And she doesn't travel just for her job. She travels very infrequently for work. So the fact that she had this was sort of an unusual thing. And so she was telling me how her husband had said that he didn't think either of them should travel while they were fighting, like basically while they weren't. And I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, feels manipulative and it feels controlling. And like, his guy's weekend is not the same thing as your work trip. Like, you need this like, I'm getting all like worked up about it. And I'm telling her this. And so then like a day or two later, she comes back to me, we talk again, and um she kind of gives me the update, and she's like, yeah, no, we talked. She's like, we talked about it, and he's really concerned about, what it could mean for our marriage if somebody did something that they regretted, or if somebody strayed from the marriage, whatever, if they were to travel and be apart while they were in this big argument. And I was like, I get it. I was like, I see how he could get there and not be manipulative and not be controlling. I could see how it didn't matter if I agreed with it or not. I could completely see how he got there without being manipulative or controlling. That was my own, so like so that was my own moment where she came back and I was like, oh yeah, I get it. I see how he gets there. So anyway, those are just a couple of examples, hopefully helpful.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually, I think it's interesting because a lot of these situations are obviously ones where things can get really heated. So kind of along those same lines, thinking about situations where people are maybe in like a full-blown argument. One person wanted to ask, like, how do you sort of approach breaking this down if it has gotten to this point? Like if there's name calling, or I feel like a lot of the examples I'm seeing are situations where someone is maybe calling someone else something along the lines of stupid, just like, I can't believe that you believe this dumb thing that you believe. If the conversation has gotten to that point, has it just broken down? Are we kind of stuck, or is there a way to back out of it once it's reached that level?
That's such a good question. Yeah, I mean, clearly you're better off if you don't get to that point. I mean, one of the things that can help is to just, to the extent that you can, and this is easier in a classroom. Well, it's not impossible to do in a conversation, but is to just be clear. Like if you're entering into a conversation with somebody, just say, okay, like, well, what are we trying to do here? What's the goal? What's the goal of whatever we're trying to do? Um, and so being clear about the goals. If you've descended into, I mean, it depends. So I would say that how you respond to that, how any person responds to that. So if you've reached the level of kind of yelling, name calling, you're stupid, whatever, um, I would, I think the answer depends on the sort of your own personal constitution and ability to deal with that kind of that kind of interaction. So for me personally, this these like politically contentious topics generally don't get under my skin. Like they just don't. But I'll get all hot and frustrated about my friends, and her marriage fighting, right? Like that'll get me really annoyed. But political topics, so the fact that they don't really get under my skin makes it easier for me to I can remain pretty calm and just kind of say, okay, well, like, but here, what would you can always ask the question, and sometimes you may be just asking it of yourself. What would I have to be treating as given? What would a person have to be treating as given to come to that conclusion? Right? So like if somebody's saying you're stupid, you're ignorant, whatever, like what would they have to be treating as given to come to that conclusion? And you get to make a choice about, do you want to bring that up to that person? Do you want to they may not want to have a conversation with you. They may just want to yell at you. And if that's the case, there's not much you can do about it. But you can go into it genuinely trying to be clear and part of this, I would say, is that this is not about agreement. It's not about getting the other. This is not a strategy for persuasion. It's not how to build a stronger argument. It's not about, and the goal is not agreement. It's so your goal with your person that you don't agree with, who thinks the weird thing about whatever, you may not change their mind, right? So like, and that's not what success necessarily looks like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that actually dovetails into a question that we got from one of our viewers
I
that
just lost audio again. Hold on, give me 1 second. Okay,
okay. Can you hear me now?
it's back.
Great.
Yeah, it's doing weird things, but I can fix it.
So we got a question from one person who actually on this idea of sort of agreeing to disagree, and I could see this potentially being our
Yeah,
last question of the night, depending on how in depth your answer is. Um, Someone asked, so if you're in that situation where you have sort of agreed to disagree, how how do we get to the point then where we are finding solutions to some of our really big problems, things like immigration, poverty, different political issues, like it how do
yeah.
we stop at agreeing to disagree and turn that into something productive?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. So agreeing to disagree, that's not where I thought the question was going. I thought it was going in a different direction. Yeah, so does here's what I think is being asked, or some version of this. Does agreeing to disagree therefore mean that we all have to just sit and, with decision paralysis and like never do anything? It doesn't. There's no reason that avoiding the certainty trap means that decisions can't be made, means that you can't advocate for what you believe in, stand up, protest, do whatever, whatever it is that you want to do politically. But to specifically come back to this point about decisions being made, policies being implemented, it doesn't mean those things can't happen. What it has implications for is how we view people who disagree with the thing that we want, the policy that we want, the decision that we want, the decision that's made. I make decision X because of my values, principles, etc. If I have the power to do so, it does change. Avoiding this certainty trap does change, or it should change, if in my view, how I view people who disagree with that. So that when it comes to our levels of social trust in institutions, these sort of foundational concepts that relate to democracy, that matters, even though decisions will still get made. It's so right. So it's about how we view the people who disagree.
I think maybe we'll go to a little bit of a less heavy topic for our final question because
Sure.
we do have one we do have time for one more. So I think for our last question we had someone write in and ask, have you seen any sort of regional difference? This person's from the Midwest originally, lives in the South now, and feels like things are a little bit different culturally.
That is such a good question. So I'm originally going, 20 years ago, I'm from the East Coast. And have been at the U of I for 20 years. Um, I'm just trying to think. So I haven't seen that. I do think that, so there's a difference. So you could imagine a difference. Um, here maybe this is one way to think about this. And one of the things that I've said, sort of a through line here, is that this relationship between certainty and judgment slash contempt is pretty consistent across, like, this is just a fundamental, like, one leads to the other. um Having said that, there are different, and this gets into the geography question a little bit, to the extent that geography is a maps onto areas of political concentration, like this is redder and this is bluer and this is right. So, like, how I would think about that question, and there may be cultural things in there as well. Like, ever in the South, everybody's friendly, and we just disagree by saying, I can't, now I'm blanking on the expression, the Southern expression. Oh, bless her heart or whatever. Right. Like, this is how we disagree. So yes, I can imagine that there would be cultural, but I would imagine also that once you're culturally competent, you sort of can read those clues differently. Um, in terms of how it maps onto kind of red and blue, there are differences. The difference between red and blue, because there's certainty on both sides. What's happened with the left is that it's part of the moral framework itself. Whereas on the right, it tends with who, and I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to say one side's worse than the other. On the right, this problem of certainty specifically tends to come from external source. It tends to come from religion, for example. On the left, it's actually part of the political framework, which has different implications. So to the extent that politics maps, a political orientation maps onto geography, that's another way to think about it.
Well, thank you so much for all of your thoughtful answers and for presenting your research to us tonight. I think it's so timely and it's so complicated, and has given us a lot of things to chew on. I'm sure folks will be, we have so many questions that we didn't get to, so thank you if you submitted. And I'm sure folks will be thinking of more questions as they kind of chew on this presentation for a while. But we really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to talk with us tonight. Thanks to everyone who attended. I'll drop some information in the chat about our next session, and I hope everyone has a great evening.